Right, so this should move more or less on from where Nick finished. So I'm going to talk about, for 11 minutes, about the NAP4 case review process. Many of you will be familiar with it, having reported cases. For those of you that haven't, it remains rather opaque. So the inclusion criteria, as Nick has already described, I think it's worth emphasising. We've had a lot of cases reported to this project. These are really the high end of complications. We are not talking about all the problems with the airway in the UK. We're talking about really major, serious events. I'd briefly like to mention Ian Calder, sitting at the front, who is one of the silent players in NAP4. Cases could be reported to me directly by email or by phone, but about a quarter of cases were also reported to Ian. I wasn't allowed to get any information about cases, so I was allowed to be told that a case had happened and where it had happened, and that it met inclusion criteria, but no other details of the case. And I'll go into the detail of that a bit more. But there were lots of cases where people weren't sure if they met inclusion criteria, and that was quite understandable. So Ian's role was to field all those queries and to discuss with the person who wished to report it whether the case should be reported. I think he probably dealt with some other issues as well, but we have not and will never discuss that. But he played a very important role in sorting out the cases. He was, however, independent of all the rest of the processes, so he did not review any of the cases. It was very important, and it was a requirement of the project, that we had a secure process. It's quite difficult, and increasingly difficult, to export patient information, rightly so, to export patient information from hospital trusts to somewhere that can look at them. So, the local reporter, or somebody wishing to report a case, anybody, informed me of the case by email. I would then email them back to confirm that the entry criteria were met, sending them a file showing in detail the inclusion criteria. They would then need to confirm to me that the inclusion criteria were met, or would take it away and discuss it with Ian. Once I received an email confirming that the inclusion criteria were met, I would then remotely, using the NAP4 website, issue a username, which I knew, and a password, which I never knew, to them. They would then log on to the website using the username and password, and could go no further without changing the password. Once in, so even if I had known the password, which I never did, I couldn't have got access. I was able to track the case by knowing the username and knowing when they'd changed their password, knowing they'd accessed the website, and knowing when the case had been fully reported. And Nick knew that there were cases on the system and was able to get access to the case report once the case was completed. I was not. So I knew when and where a case had been reported from, and I knew no case details. Excuse me. In contrast, Nick, once the case had been completed, knew the case details, but had no idea where the case came from. Had we got together and tried to put the information together, we could have tried. But actually, because cases came from all sorts of places, and we didn't have the right information to put any two cases together and say, this is the case that came from there, and this is what they're informing us of. So I never knew the details of the case. Although I knew where they came from, I never knew what they were, and Nick the other side. So I'll just go through that process. So this is me reporting a case to myself. Tim, many thanks for getting in touch with me. So I then send the relevant documents as 3 files, inclusion criteria, information for what the reporter of a case should do, and also a support pack. We were aware that many of these cases were potentially career-changing for some anaesthetists, certainly very important. And therefore there was a support back that went pretty much with every email I sent to people who'd reported cases. I asked for the person who'd reported the case, in this case me, to confirm that the case met inclusion criteria, and then when I received the information to say that it did meet inclusion criteria, I then sent back a file about issuing a username and how they should access the website. I then created a username, as you can see at the top, and the email to which it should go. So here it's going to my home email address, and I had successfully created a user, in this case to me. So I could access as the administrator, I could access to see what cases were in progress. This is the email I received as a user, giving me a username and a password. I then access the Difficult Airway Society / NAP4 website, and I'm able to log in using the username and the password. I must immediately change it to go any further. Having changed it, I then have the daunting task of filling in many pages of report details, and we took a lot of information, and we have extracted an enormous amount of information. The spreadsheet for anaesthesia cases had, I think, about 90,000 data points in it, many of which were free text. So there's a lot of data on the cases, and that's about 2/3 of all the cases. Different forms for airway management during anaesthesia, ITU, HDU, and the emergency department. And broadly, there was a structured questionnaire covering these aspects. A lot of it was free text, and we extracted much of the information from free text, but also the processes and the devices used were very usefully extracted from the Excel spreadsheet. So you can see down here, these are the processes that the reporter has to go through in reporting cases. I think there are 170, something like 170 questions for the anaesthesia cases. Relatively user-friendly, but quite a lot to put in, and people could put information in and then pause. So this was a key thing, a brief description of the event, and that was very useful to us, but a lot of important and clear information. And for the anaesthesia cases, the ITU and emergency department were slightly shorter, but you can see the extent of there'll probably be 5 or 6 questions on each of those issues. If it was a mask, ventilation or tracheal intubation problem, then a lot of these would collapse, and so you wouldn't have to ask all those questions. The website was set up by Jared Rangasamy, who's here, and he did a fantastic job in doing that, and he and his colleagues running it and keeping it running. It crashed once for 24 hours in a year, or in 18 months, which I think is pretty astonishing. So we wanted to know the circumstances surrounding the event, who were the anaesthetists, how many there were, who started, who finished, and then later on where it happened, what was the airway management, what special techniques were used, if direct access was used. So an enormous amount of detail. I won't flip through the rest of the pages, but a lot about the anaesthetic technique, and when you ticked on one such as direct tracheal access, you would have to fill in a lot more information about that as opposed to difficult intubation. And in terms of the processes and availability of help, who was involved, how quickly did help come, etc., etc., we also extracted information on that, which gives us some information about to a certain extent, teamwork, human factors, communication. As I've said, 3 different forms for 3 different groups of problems. So we had 287 cases submitted, rather more than we hoped for. After review by Ian Calder and sending them back to the local reporters, we ended up with 207 cases that we reviewed in total. And here's the review panel in their glory. And it's absolutely certain that everybody worked really, really hard on this. We had a broad cross-section of people from intensive care, the emergency department, AFPP, College of ODPs, etc., etc., and most anaesthetic organisations represented. And everybody worked hard. So here are the groups. We had two surgeons, an ENT surgeon, Paul Precy, and a Max-Vax surgeon, Sat Palmer, who came to a few meetings to discuss particular cases with direct surgical relevance, and they were very helpful. The review process I'll go through in some detail, but there are various sorts of bias when you have peer review processes. One is outcome bias. There was a nice paper in Anesthesiology a few years ago as part of the close claims analysis, and they sent the same case to reviewers, but they changed the outcome. And the analysis of whether care had been of a reasonable standard or below standard changed dramatically by about 30%, so it was considered more adverse when the outcome had been fatal, and less adverse when there had been a good outcome. So outcome bias is something that can affect peer review. Hindsight bias, I'd never have done that, is why on earth did they do that? When you know that something's gone wrong, well, I wouldn't have started with a laryngeal mask for that case, clearly. Following day. Is another bias. There's another bias which I don't think has a name. It's called groupthink, and it's described in this paper, an excellent paper by Ted Crosby, which shows that if you have a group of people reviewing a case, there tends to be agreement within the group. If you have another group, there tends to be agreement in that group, but the groups may well differ in their opinion. So there's within group agreement and between group disagreement. So we mentioned all these biases every time we came to meet. They were written down on the review sheet as things that we should talk about. We could not avoid them, but we were aware of them. So what we did, we had what's called a structured implicit review. We had a team review. We always had a group of at least 10, usually about 15 from that 21 people. And we divided into two groups which were balanced in terms of their specialties and their medical and non-medical individuals. And so the two groups divided, and we'd take roughly half of the 15 cases that we reviewed each day, took all day. And so one group would review 7 cases, the other group 7 or 8. Actually, we would both review 8 with one overlapped case. Having reviewed them, we would then join together, and the 8 cases reviewed by Group A would be presented to Group B, and we would then discuss that case. And we would discuss the findings from Group A, and they'd be moderated by Group B. So we had peer review. We were aware of hindsight and bias, but we're not able to avoid it completely. And we had 2 groups which reviewed the cases twice to avoid groupthink. We did refer to guidelines and we did refer to recommendations where appropriate, but often they're not appropriate. They have to be appropriate to a specific case, to a specific time, they have to be from the UK, etc., etc. So often they're not appropriate, and often there's no benchmark to deal with these cases. We did have disagreements, and we discussed some cases at great length, accepting and discussing disagreements. We didn't resolve all of them, but we resolved most of them. And what we ended up with was a group of, I believe they were a group of experts, exploring the truth. We didn't divine the truth. We were looking at paper-based records, and those don't contain all the information that was necessary. So we don't end up with the truth. We end up with a view of what happened. We may be wrong in some cases. This is the output that we had. We confirmed that the case met the process. We first confirmed the case met inclusion criteria. Was it comprehensible? If it wasn't, we went back to the reporter to glean more information, done remotely, so that we couldn't find, neither of us knew who the case was from again. We graded the final outcome both by MPSA classification of severity of incident and also extracting deaths and brain damage. And then we categorised factors. I'll go through the list of what we categorised it as causal, contributory, or where factors are actually positive in the outcome. And we identified themes and illustrative cases or vignettes, which you'll see dotted around the report. So the MPSA severity of harm, this is from the, can't remember the document, 7 steps to patient safety is the original document from the MPSA, and you can read it for yourself what none, low, moderate, severe harms are. So no harm, temporary, permanent, significant but not permanent, and permanent. But if you read the detail down below, you'll see that so if someone for instance had a heart attack and went to ITU but recovered, or had a tracheostomy but made a full recovery, those would be rated as moderate outcomes, not severe. We judged if someone had spent more than a month on intensive care that they wouldn't have made a full recovery and therefore caused those severe. We could debate that, but there weren't that many of those cases. And in terms of the positive contributory and causal factors, they were again from the same MPSA document, which was very useful. We used these definitions, and these are reproduced in the paper, in the BJA paper, and obviously in the report, which gave us some idea as to what were the things that were leading to this. But you can see that it was a very structured report, process that we went through, and this is what we came out with. Was it included? Yes, no. Was it accurate, consistent, and clear? What was the outcome judged on the MPSA classification? What were the contributory factors? And we made a judgment as to what the quality of the airway management was. Was it good? Was it poor? Was it mixed? Or did we not have enough information? Some reports were scanty. Did we not have enough information to form a judgment? And we made comments. Briefly, a point that's important to mention is, did we get all of the cases? And I'll skip through this reasonably quickly. The answer is almost certainly we didn't. Referring to Rumsfield, we don't know what we didn't get. The unknown unknowns. This is month by month, how many cases were reported. And you'll see there's quite a wide variation. And if we look at the, so in blue is the date of notification, and in purple is the date of the event. So September may be a bad month, March may be a bad month in terms of when the events occurred. It's great to have an anaesthetic in January, but also that's probably when we sent a reminder to people to report events. So there may have been, we're not certain that this isn't just people have been reminded, they remember to send cases in. There's some hospital clustering. One hospital sent in 7 cases. One hospital sent in 5 cases, 8 sent in 3, 177 hospitals sent in no cases. So looked at another way, 1/300th of the cases reported 3% of the cases. This has jumped around a bit. Less than 1% reported 6% of the cases, and on and on. 6% of hospitals reported 34% of cases. So if you put that into a Poisson distribution, JD, you'll find that that is consistent with the Poisson distribution. So it's possible that we got all the cases. We don't believe we did. We also looked at individual clustering. So if we, from the college census, we know how many consultants and anaesthetists there are. And what we also know that there are 286 local reporters, and what proportion they are of consultants and of all anaesthetists. So there were 19 cases of the 133 anaesthesia cases that were reported by individuals who were both local reporter and the person anaesthetising. It's likely, we think, that local reporters would be motivated to report most of the cases, or all the cases, that they're involved with. We're not sure that that would be the case for other anaesthetists. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but local reporters accounted for 15% of anaesthesia cases, and only they should have accounted for a much smaller proportion of that, because they represent only about 3% of all anaesthetists and 5% of all consultants. And therefore, if you put those into tables and do chi-squared tests on them, there's a disproportionate number of cases reported by local reporters. If you assume that that everybody behaved as a local reporter, we'd have had somewhere between 5 and 6 times as many cases as were reported. But as discussed in the paper, we moderate that down because of the way anaesthetic departments work, and we believe that we've probably missed 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 4 cases. So we've got a third to a quarter of the cases, we believe. And that's probably the same in ITU as well. So in ITU in the emergency department, it's likely we've missed a similar proportion of cases. Okay, thanks very much.